Hello everyone, this is the final talk in our series on Jonah. We're on the fourth and final chapter, which is an absolutely fantastic chapter. It brings it all together, the themes within Jonah, but also has a really interesting and slightly surprising ending. And I have to say, chapter 4 I think is probably the most overlooked in the story. Most people can remember chapters 1 and 2, Jonah fleeing and being eaten by the fish. Some might be able to articulate the themes in chapter 3 of where he is successful in his conversion of Nineveh. But then the final chapter is a bit random because it feels like chapter 3, the successful conversion of Nineveh, that's where it should finish. That kind of big happy ending, roll credits moment should be. That's what it feels like, but it doesn't. Jonah kind of goes off the rails a little bit here. And it's really interesting because Jonah becomes incredibly angry after those in Nineveh convert, and it says this in chapter 4. But this was very displeasing to Jonah, and he became angry. He prayed to the Lord and said, "O Lord, is not this what I said while I was still in our own country? That is why I fled to Tarshish at the beginning, for I knew that you are a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and ready to relent from punishing. And now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live." And Jonah is very often, he does not do well in this story. He's seen as the hero, but throughout Jonah he continues to make mistakes, he gets it wrong, and he really gets it wrong in chapter 4. Because he has received God's mercy. He received God's love and saving power in his life, which led him to Nineveh in the first place, which enabled him to be successful. And yet he received that grace, but doesn't want it for the people of Nineveh. He doesn't believe they're deserving of it, even though he wasn't deserving of God's grace, but still received it. He feels that those in Nineveh should definitely not have God's grace, that they are not deserving. This is really interesting because he becomes so angry. Angry, he says, to the point of death. That he says, "You've done this thing so much that I want my life to end." That he essentially wanted to cut all ties with God with the ending of his life. He was putting this belief that the people of Nineveh should die, he was putting that above his relationship with God, that was more important. He shows that was the bottom line. God, I want to die now. There's nothing more. That was his bottom line. That those in Nineveh should not be saved. And that's a problem. That is a huge problem. And God says, is it right for you to be angry? That question, is it right? Should you be angry? You've received my grace before. They're just receiving what you receive. So why should you be angry? And the problem is, Jonah's priorities are all skewed. And I suspect there's a fear within Jonah. We've spoken about the danger and the threat that Assyria presents to the people and the nations around it. And so I suspect there's for Jonah, a prophet from Israel, a concern that because they've survived, that there's a threat there for Israel. Jonah's putting his needs ahead of the needs of others. And that's the problem. We all have these needs and these wants. We all draw attachment to things. And this, God illustrates these attachment problems that we have perfectly. In this moment, he allows a tree to grow. Jonah goes outside of Nineveh, hoping to stick around. Maybe God will change his mind and he will raze the city to the ground, so he sticks around for a bit. And he's sat in the sun, and it's a boiling hot day. And God brings forth in the night a bush so that he can sit under in the heat of the day. And Jonah's quite pleased about this. He's like, "Oh, this is great, this is great." Then in the night again, God brings a worm, and it eats the part of the tree, and it dies. And Jonah in the morning becomes angry that this has happened. He's furious. He's back to the same anger that he was in the beginning of the chapter. How could this happen to me? God, how can you have done this? I'm at the point of death. And he says that again. And Jonah attaches himself to this tree. He has an attachment to it. That's why he's upset when he loses it. He's attached to it. He didn't choose to. He just became attached to it because of what it gave him. And he has that same attachment with Israel, with his country. He fears that. He wanted someone out, another nation, to die just so his nation could be possibly saved because of the threat that Assyria presents. But the problem is with these attachments is when they become so important to us that it's at the detriment of other people. Some of our attachments, they aren't necessarily bad or anything like that. We all attach ourselves to various different things, some good, some bad. But God, in the illustration of this bush, is trying to show Jonah that he's become so attached to something that it makes him so angry that he wants harm to befall others. That bush represents Jonah's feelings about his own country. That means that it drives him to want those of Assyria to be destroyed. And God is saying, actually, you shouldn't be putting those things so much higher than the needs of others, or so much higher than the grace of God. Because Jonah had arrived at a point of idolatry. Because actually it had become more important than God. He's saying, actually, God, I don't care about you anymore. Just kill me now. I don't want that relationship with you anymore. It had become so important to Jonah that his relationship with God was suffering. He was putting something ahead of God, which is idolatry. And so much so that it actually made him an evil person, wanting the death of others. And often we can do the same. We can have these needs and these desires, these attachments that sometimes we put ahead of God. We make them more important than our relationship with God. Maybe not to the point of Jonah, but we all have those things which draw us away from God and draw us away from caring and being kind to others. The beautiful thing about Jonah is that it's about the unending grace of God. It harks forward to all that God will do through Jesus on the cross. That none of us are deserving of God's grace, but he is going to give it to us anyway, unconditionally. Even when we make the mistakes that Jonah did, even when we make the mistakes like the people of Nineveh did, God's grace is there for us. And so as we consider the beautiful theme of grace that has been throughout Jonah, we need to consider, how do we give grace to others? That's where Jonah failed ultimately. He received God's grace, but he couldn't give it to others. He could fathom God's grace. He even articulates it very well, but he couldn't fathom it for others. And so as we think of that theme of grace, we think that it's there for us in our failings, but it's also there for others. So if it's there for others and God gives it to others, then we should be graceful to them. To be there for people, not to let our political beliefs or our economic beliefs or whatever become so important that we're unkind to others or we turn a blind eye to others' suffering. But to be like God, to give out grace unconditionally, to give out love unconditionally. So as we reflect on the story of Jonah, to be reminded of God's grace for us and for others, and let us do the same. Give grace to ourselves when we fail, but give grace to others when they fall short too. Amen.